Hey folks, this is Jake here and Bandit from Canadian Cutting Edge. Today we're going to take a look at blade shapes. What are the basic blade shapes for knives? And I'm thinking about folding knives and small fixed blade knives. Not talking about things that are the size of machetes, even small machetes or anything like that. And even then, even though I'm restricting it to these smaller handheld knives, 5 inches and smaller for the blade size, generally 3.5 inches and smaller is very, very common. I just want to cover the basic blade shapes that are out there. I can't cover them all and what their uses are, and then we'll move on from there. I've got so much I want to cover, I'm going to have to split this up into quite a few different videos. Thanks for stopping by to Canadian Cutting Edge University, not a real educational institution. And let's get started. Okay, so we've got a knife here. First, let's put some boundaries on what we're saying. Number one, I am not the expert. I might not even be an expert, but I can make mistakes, I can be wrong, and I might be. You can go ahead and correct me down below. The second thing is there's often the same things that are used by different names in different places. So there's two factors going on. I can be wrong. Sometimes things have multiple names. Actually, it's super common, especially in English. We use different words for the same thing all the time. And so there might be some disagreements. As long as you keep the disagreements, friendly discussion, say whatever you want in the comment section, disagree, correct, any constructive criticism, all that stuff is totally and actually requested. I welcome it. So next step is to talk about the different parts of the knife. We're going to ignore the handle for today. We're talking about the blade. What is the grind on the blade? Well, for our discussion today, when we say grind, we're going to talk about the main bevel. So that's on this knife, it's this main big side right here. Now you can get a lot of different kinds of bevels. When I say edge or final grind, I'm talking about that little bit of sharpening that's done right along the entire cutting edge. So that's the edge or the final grind. And another word I'm going to use interchangeably between tip and point. I'm talking about that part of the knife right there. Now let's get into some terminology. First off, we're going to talk about the straight back knife. Now that's a knife where the back, the spine of the blade follows the spine of the handle in a straight line. I don't have a lot of those knives, but I've got a few. Here's one of them that I got recently, and it's a very fine example of it because you just have this paracord on here to cover it up, but you can see that the spine of the handle here, and that's a perfectly straight line. That's an old style knife, and it's very common still, although it's becoming less common. And the main reason it's becoming less common is because people just change a little bit of shape. Very often it's got just a very bit of a drop somewhere along the spine towards the tip where it comes down just a little bit, and then it's no longer a straight spine knife. Now the straight spine knife is a strong design for a blade. The blade is very strong. It usually ends up being a knife that's used for basic tasks around in the kitchen, around the house, all kinds of different trades. People might have this kind of knife. It's just for general purpose cutting. You can get all kinds of different bevels and grinds on them, but the spine of the thing is simply straight like that. On larger versions of the knife, and one that doesn't have this kind of swedge put on here, one of the huge benefits of this kind of knife is if you need to cut through something strong and thick and hard and it's just not working very well. Let's imagine for a second, let's go back here. Let's imagine this is a straight back knife. It's not, it's got a drop point, but imagine it's a straight back knife. It's when you have to put your hand on the spine here to help push it through something. Now, of course, you can do that with a drop point knife, but straight back knives were originally designed. That's one of the purposes of having a nice big straight back. The tips of those blades may or may not be strong. It all depends on the type of grind, how the grind ends near the tip of the blade. They can make it very strong, or it can be made with a very weak tip. So it really depends on how the bevel is ground on the knife. One of the tasks that's commonly used for those kinds of knives, if it does come to a little bit of a tip, and it's for doing some minor piercing. So the tip of the blade on a straight back can often be used for piercing tasks. And, you know, that's the general straight back knife. Let's keep moving because we don't have a lot of time. The next knife we want to talk about is the trailing point knife. And I really like that style, and I don't really have all that many of them. I should get some more. Some people will call it a Persian style. Basically, it's when you've got the spine of the handle going across to the spine of the blade. The tip of the knife comes up higher. Now, this one's not very dramatically so, and it's hard to tell because we don't have a straight spine on the blade. But here's sort of a straight edge, and see how the tip of the blade comes up and gets hidden behind that straight edge when I'm using, you know, this straight part here, using that line, not the last part of the handle, but that line goes straight across and the tip comes up a little bit higher. Now, often on trailing point blades, you can get the tip a whole lot higher. One of the very common knives of this style is the fillet knife. Now, this fillet knife, you know, you can see it comes up to a tip there, and that's very, very common on a fillet knife. It may not come up very high, but it's the general style of the knife where you got the spine of the handle, spine of the blade coming, and then it comes up to a tip. So it's very commonly used that way. So it's a good style for skinning, for, you know, cutting, slicing action type cutting. You usually have a really big belly on these types of knives, and, you know, a big bellied knife, this is the belly here, is designed generally for doing a lot of slicing. Moving right along, the next one that we want to look at is the clip point. A Bowie knife is the same way. Some people call it Bowie. I'm not going to say one's right and one's wrong. I just use Bowie. This is the Buck 110. It has that style of knife right here. A clip point, it can or might not be with a radius on this clip. Generally, you got a straight spine on the blade, and then somewhere beyond halfway down, usually, but not always, you know, some steel's been taken away to get towards the tip. When it's got a little curve like this, and especially when you also add little swedges on there like these, let's get this a little closer here. So when you've got a shape like this, you got a little bit of swedge there, that's the style that's very, very common on a clip point knife. You can have other styles for a clip point knife. Here's another example of a clip point, and it's kind of a dramatic clip point. You've got a little bit of a hump here, so it's a harpoon style. That's one of the varieties of clip point knives, at least in my opinion. Opinions may vary, but, you know, the edge coming close to the tip, you know, it just clips off. This time it's in a straight line. So it can be anywhere along there and, you know, coming towards the tip. And you generally have a knife that has a fairly good strength tip. The point on it's usually pretty good. It's designed for piercing at the tip again. So good to poke holes in things, whatever kind of thing you need to poke a hole in. And, you know, like I said, it can be curved. It can be straight. Now, some people might want to call this a sheepfoot. I'm not sure if somebody wants to call it that or not, but maybe. Somebody might want to call it something else, but generally I call this kind of thing a clip point blade. Let's keep moving. And now for the drop point blade. Maybe I should have done this one first because this is, in all likelihood, the most common type of knife in existence for, you know, the kind of knives that we're discussing in our video today. Between folding knives of almost any length to, you know, hand knives, outdoor knives, you know, things that are, you know, 5 inches or less. Drop points, so super common. And basically, the spine comes along and starts to drop down at some kind of curved radius. Generally, if it's a straight line that it comes down on, let me show another example that I didn't show before. There's this knife here. You know, you might want to say that these two knives are very similar, but this one's got a straight edge from there and it comes straight down. So I call that clip. So a clip is either straight or a negative radius, you know, like the Bowie. Drop point is sort of on a curve. It just sort of drops away. The big benefit of this type of knife is you usually have a very strong tip, and you usually have a good size belly. So it's the most common kind of knife blade because it's useful for the most different types of tasks. It's the generalist for knife blades. And you can do just about anything you want to do with a drop point blade. So like this one, you can see very clearly how strong that tip is because it's nice and thick until it comes down to that tip. On this one, we've got a flat grind with a good sized belly. So it's great for doing, hunting, some skinning maybe. You've got a straight edge here, for slicing through stuff or pushing down through things. This one's got a nice wide spine. So since it's a nice drop point, I can still use my hand behind it for extra force. It's just a very good style knife where the spine just drops away. Drop point. It's so easy to remember what that is. Now, it may or may not have something like this. This one's got a swedge on it. Now, when a swedge gets thinner, if this was a longer knife, you don't want to use it on your hand to push down because you're pushing on a thin edge and you're going to potentially hurt yourself. One of the other things to be very clear is this tip is great for doing delicate work, but it's not really designed for piercing in, but it's for cutting along, the edges of stuff, getting in on something and getting behind it like when you're skinning. So that's how this knife blade is generally used. Okay, now we'll talk about Tanto blades. Now, I'm talking about Western Tanto blades. Tanto blades find their origin from Japan. Traditional Japanese Tanto blades, you can have them with this style of tip, this very angular tip, but they also have Tanto blades that are very curved, and they're not with a sharp edge like this. But for our discussion here, I'm going to talk about Western Tantos, so it's going to have a transition where there is a definite corner where we've got one cutting edge that meets another cutting edge, and it's a small edge at the tip and a longer straight belly, generally speaking. So here's 3 examples of it. So if we start from the handle moving forward, we've got a straight edge. Very often, almost always, a Tanto has got a flat grind, a small flat grind coming up, usually up to the middle. So this one's got a high flat grind. This one's got one coming, just past the middle. That's very common. And then we've got an angle where it comes up. Now that angle can be almost any angle, but it's generally 45 degrees or less. And this side here has got its own grind as well. So this cutting edge and this cutting edge, each one's got their own grind. As you can see on these ones, let me bring them nice and close so you can see that more clearly. This one's a little bit tricky to see depending on the angles, but there's a line right there where the transition changes and the grind changes angles there. On this one, the grind angle is also on an angle, and it changes right there in a definite corner. And then there's this one. You can see the same thing. Now, very often modern Tantos these days, especially Western ones, they're drop point Tantos. So the spine isn't straight. This one's fairly straight, but it comes down first. This one definitely comes down first. Very big drop point here. So we don't have an awful lot these days with the straight spine. So we don't have a lot of straight spine knives for folding knives in the Tanto class. They generally are some kind of drop point or clip point as well. Now, what's good and what's the purpose of this kind of knife? Well, it's a very strong blade. If you do need to pierce something, there's a lower chance that the tip's going to break on this kind of blade than almost any other shape. But it's not optimized for piercing. You see videos, especially cold steel videos, where they're going through car hoods and roofs and you're just stabbing right through. That's showing how durable it is to stab through stuff, but not that it's designed for that kind of task. So it can handle it, but it's not optimal for piercing. If you want to do piercing optimally, then get a dagger. So this is the Tanto. Some people call this a reverse Tanto. Now, I'm of the opinion that there's no such thing as a reverse Tanto. If this edge were sharpened, then I wouldn't call it a reverse Tanto either. I would simply call it a blade with, a bit of a second bevel, like a bit of a dagger tip. But when the edge comes back this way, something past 90, now this is either, and we're going to talk about that, either Sheepsfoot or Wharncliffe, but it's not a reverse Tanto, although reverse Tanto is something that a lot of people use that word, that term, it's kicking around, so I'm going to talk about it right now. Simply that exists. I just disagree with that term. I don't like it because it isn't really all that helpful. There's other terms that already encompass the style of knives that people call reverse Tantos. So there's that. Tanto for me is always a definite angle here, and the blade going, the edge going towards the tip is on another angle, and it's short. And that's generally what a Tanto is. Very strong, very durable, and it's just a really strong type of blade. We've got to keep going. I've got so much more I want to say, but we just don't have time. This next group of knives I'm putting into one classification. It's the Sheepsfoot Wharncliffe style knives. Now, in my opinion, those are two different things, but for most people, they don't see that distinction, so I'm going to put them together. But I will tell you what my distinction is. This knife I call a Wharncliffe. What we have is a straight blade. The cutting edge is flat. If I lean it up against something, I don't have a straight edge. Yes, I do. Here's a straight edge on this handle. I put it up on this handle. Got to do it in a way that you can see it. Oh, that's actually got a curve to it. It's curving down there, so it's not straight. But basically, you can see it's a straight line. And then the spine drops down in one arc to meet it. So drop, long drop way down to the cutting edge. That's a Wharncliffe. Now, Sheepsfoot, that's what I call this one, where you've got a belly on the blade, but the spine does the same thing. Now, you can have two different kinds of grinds and have them both be, I could have a hollow grind here and it would still be a Wharncliffe. I could have a flat grind here and it would still be a Sheepsfoot, because this one right now is hollow and that one's flat, and it doesn't really matter. What's this? Well, it's neither. It's not a Tanto. It's not a Sheepsfoot. It's another option. It's a drop point. I'm just sprinkling this in there to show some knives, and a lot of knives these days, just don't follow the basic rules. And that's fine. I like that an awful lot. But Sheepsfoot, Wharncliffe, has nothing to do with the length of it. It's all about radius with this drop down or straight with a drop down. Those are Sheepsfoot. What are these good for? These are excellent food prep style knives. If you've got this style knife, camping and stuff, it's great. It's good for doing tip delicate work, although not for piercing. One of the main purposes of these knives going down this way is so that you can't pierce. A lot of guys, when they're teaching their kids how to use knives, they introduce them first to either a safety knife, where the tip is rounded right off, or a dramatic Sheepsfoot or Wharncliffe blade. Sheepsfoot especially is really good because it's much more blunt. It's really hard to stab. You can get a little bit of a cut for sure, but you're not going to stab right into another person very easily with that kind of tip. So it's great for cutting, food prep, slicing, dicing, whatever you want to do, and the tip is a little bit safer than some other knives. I should say one of the other benefits, especially of a Wharncliffe with this straight edge here, is this is a good knife to learn to sharpen on. You've just got a straight line to sharpen. If you're sharpening by hand or if you're sharpening with a guided sharpening system, that kind of edge is the best edge to learn on. This is the hawkbill or the talon style blade. Now, I'm just talking about the way the blade's shaped. I'm just talking about the basic claw kind of style. So if you think of a claw on either, a dinosaur or on a raptor, a bird of prey, their claw comes down like that and it's sharp on that edge, really good for grabbing into something and holding on. Well, for this kind of thing, it's really good for cutting things that you want to maintain control of while you're cutting. In construction or in home renovation, this style knife is often used for cutting linoleum and cutting carpet. They won't have a handle quite like this. The handle will come back. Maybe I've got one. Yeah, I've got one. This one is by Mora. And that's why it's got that short Scandi grind, so it's a flat piece of steel with a little bit of a grind. But that's exactly what it's for. Grabbing, pulling, and cutting through stuff. Works really well for that. What is this type of knife for? Clearly this is a fighting knife. So it's designed to rip into a living creature and put it down. So I don't have a lot of these. I've got very few of these. A subclass of those knives is this, the recurve. And the recurve can have almost anything going on the spine, almost anything going on the tip, but it's when the cutting edge, it often has a belly and then it comes back up and then back again. So it's the opposite of a belly. We've got a negative radius. So positive radius, negative radius, positive radius, negative radius, and it's used for the same purpose. It's for, guiding something into this section so it stays there while you're cutting it. So very often to cut through things that like to move while you're cutting it, like a piece of twine or some rope or some cordage of some kind. A recurve very often helps keep what you're cutting in contact with that cutting edge and makes it easier to cut through it. I really like recurves. A lot of people don't like recurves because they are more challenging to sharpen, but there are certainly some really good ways to sharpen a recurve that are not all that difficult, but that's outside the scope of this video. Next is the Dagger. They don't have to have basically symmetrical sides on them, but usually they do, very close to symmetrical. It's got a cutting edge on both sides of the blade, and the handle safely removed, and a very sharp tip, generally made for piercing actions. So throwing knives, like this is a throwing knife, very often have those two cutting edges so that depending on where it is in its rotation, it's more likely to catch and, grab onto the wood, stick in or whatever. So there's that. You've got boot knives. You can have daggers that have handles that go across. By the way, in Canada, handles on daggers that go across, the blade's this way. If the handle goes that way, that's illegal in Canada. Like the sort of T shape. But other daggers are totally legal in Canada, like this one here. No problem at all having this. And it's got that typical kind of shape where it's the same on both sides. And again, you can have any kind of grind. It's this two-edgedness that's important. There's different kind of daggers that come to a point. You got needlepoint knives where it comes really thin to a point. You can have three-edged daggers where you've got three bevels in a triangle shape. So there's a cutting edge there, and a cutting edge there in that kind of shape. You can have them in a square and then they twist. Really hard to sharpen those guys. And, all kinds of different things, but primarily they are a knife or a tool for piercing, stabbing something quickly and dispatching it that way in a hurry. This next style of blade is not so common, so we won't spend very much time on it. It's basically a version of a sheepsfoot blade. As you can see, it has just a tiny little section before the cutting edge that is cut back. So we've got flat part, belly, and this tiny little cut back, and then the spine. Same thing on this one. Comes up, tiny little cut back, and then you've got this wedge going up. Basically, it's a style of knife blade that was used for spaying animals. So this was for farmers, ranchers, cattlemen, sheep herders, all kinds of critters, where you need to turn the males into non-gender critters or non-sexed, so that they don't have the ability to reproduce. And they use a knife that's specially made for the task, and it looks like that. Most little Victorinox, your pocket knives that have multi-blades very often will have one of these little spay point blades. Pros and cons of these, well, the tip is quite strong and you can be fairly precise with it. And that's one of the reasons why it's there. You might even say that this type of blade is the first safety tip blade, and that's what we're talking about next. It's the blunt tipped knives. Now these are generally not popular knives amongst knife collectors. Oh, there's just some marker residue, and I was checking the angle on here. They're basically any kind of knife where the tip of the knife has been rounded off. So, you know, I can jam it into my hand and it's not going to stab me because it's been rounded off. It's a blunt tip. It's solely for one purpose, safety. And that's why they're made that way. They're made so they're safe. You can't puncture into things. So a lot of people like to use these for training, or they use them in different kinds of areas of work where there's piercing not needed at all. It's just cutting. And so you take away the ability for it to pierce, and you've made the knife that much safer. And that's why it exists. So that is a basic overview of a lot of different types of knives. But as you saw, some knives are strange. Like this one here. That's got a wave thing, so it catches on your pocket. So when you pull this knife out of your pocket, it automatically deploys the blade. But you got a swedge and a drop point on a funny, weird Tanto edge. What's up with that? And then you can get really weird stuff like, what's up with this? This is a Tanto Recurve, separate cutting edge, major recurve. There's serrations up here. You know, I've done a video of it. I basically pulled this out right now to show you there are no rules. There's not one name that you can call this kind of knife because, you know, it just does whatever it wants. And knife makers can do the same thing. Now, one thing I've noticed becoming popular is something that looks a bit like a Tanto, but there's not a sharp corner right here. Like this one's got a sharp corner. This one's got a rounded corner. And it doesn't have the difference in the two different grinds, at least not much of one. Or this. You know, you've got a really thin, very delicate, very precise point. Well, maybe not very delicate, but somewhat delicate. And, you know, it's a little unusual. There's all kinds of knives. There are no rules that this kind of knife is this kind of thing, because there's so many that are sort of just taking the different styles and they're melding them together and making a new thing. And I like it. I love it. It just makes it a little bit harder for us to say, you know, to categorize the knife. This is such and such a knife. Very often we can still do it, but sometimes we can't. So with knives, I tend to be quite gracious with the different names of the things. I let you be wrong, you let me be wrong, and we both let each other be right. And we just happily get along because we enjoy knives. And the main reason for doing this terminology video is not to be right or wrong, is to facilitate communication so that we can communicate with one another. So when you say something, let me turn this light on. So that when you say something about a knife, I know what you mean. When I say something about a knife, you're likely to know what I mean. And so that's why we need to have terminology. Terminology is our helper, not our slave driver. So what did you think of this video? What knife type did I miss? And I'm not talking about grind type. I'm talking about blade shape type. Let me know in the comment section below if I missed something. I can do a little addendum video. In another week, maybe 2 weeks, the next video is going to be about the types of grind. So talking about the types of bevel and the types of finishing edge. Those are the two main, or that's one subject, those two main aspects of it that I'm going to cover in the next Canadian Cutting Edge University Knives 101, you know, information for knife newbies kind of video that will be coming out probably in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. Thanks for liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. If you want to help out my channel with any kind of donation, be it monetary or a knife or whatever you want to do, let me know. Email me at CanadianCuttingEdge@gmail.com. Send me a comment. Send me some info, and we'll do great. Thank you very much to everybody who helps me out. It's very much appreciated. And remember, always cut towards your chum, not your thumb. Oh, that could hurt.